The ethical substance kept the antithesis confined within its simply unitary consciousness and preserved this consciousness in an immediate unity with its essence. Essence has, therefore, the simple determinateness of mere being for consciousness, which is directed immediately upon it and is the essence in the form of custom. Consciousness neither thinks of itself as this particular exclusive self, nor has substance the significance of an existence excluded from it, with which it would have to become united only by alienating itself from itself and at the same time producing the substance itself. But the spirit whose self is an absolutely discrete unit has its content confronting it as an equally hard, unyielding reality. And here, the world has the character of being something external, the negative of self-consciousness. This world is, however, a spiritual entity. It is in itself the interfusion of being and individuality. This, its existence, is the work of self-consciousness, but it is also an alien reality already present and given, a reality which has a being of its own and in which it does not recognize itself. This real world is the external essence and the free content of legal right. But this external world, which the Lord of the world of legal right takes to himself, is not merely this elemental being confronting the self as something contingently given. On the contrary, it is his work, but not in a positive, rather in a negative sense. It obtains its existence through self-consciousness' own externalization and separation of itself from its essence, which in the ruin and devastation which prevail in the world of legal right, seems to inflict on self-consciousness from without the violence of the liberated elements. These by themselves are sheer ruin and devastation and the dissolution of themselves. This dissolution, however, this negative nature of theirs is just the self. It is their subject, their activity, and their process. But this activity and process whereby the substance becomes actual is the alienation of the personality. For the self that has an absolute significance in its immediate existence, that is, without having alienated itself from itself, is without substance and is the plaything of those raging elements. Its substance, therefore, is its externalization, and the externalization is the substance, that is, the spiritual powers ordering themselves into a world and thereby preserving themselves. In paragraph 484, we are now entering a new section of this massive spirit portion of the work. And this new intermediate section is quite long. It's also organized a little bit differently than some of the preceding sections have been. You notice that in this we're going to have three main portions, but the portions are broken up in different ways, and the third portion is just one long sequence. So this entire section is called Self-Alienated Spirit, Sich entfremdete Geist, and culture. This word Bildung that Hegel uses, that we devoted a good deal of discussion to much earlier on in the work when he was talking about this in the preface. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about Bildung right now, in part because we're going to spend so much time going through it as we make our way through this section. But I do want to point out that Bildung has a more active connotation than what we typically associate with culture. We look at culture primarily in terms of something that a person has, or in terms of the material culture, the things that embody a cultural perspective or embody the sort of thing that an ethnologist would study. And Bildung extends all the way into education. So that's enough to say about that. Hegel is talking here in this very first paragraph about this transition, and he references back to the previous developments and paragraphs, particularly those in the legal standing section that we just made our way through. But he begins from what might seem like a strange starting point. He talks about the ethical substance keeping this antithesis, this contradiction, confined within its simply unitary consciousness. And then he says it preserved this consciousness in immediate unity with its essence. Essence has, therefore, simple determinateness of mere being for consciousness, which is directed immediately upon it, and is the essence in the form of custom. So when we say this, it sounds like, well, isn't that like a reversion back to previous stages? And it's worth considering and keeping in mind that Hegel does intend this dialectic to be kind of, jumping forward and then sometimes falling back a bit and moving forward, falling back. The other thing to keep in mind is that we're moving historically from essentially the ancient period, which we've sort of traversed in the Greek city-state and the Roman city-state, as far as Hegel is interpreting them, into things like world empires. We can think of the Roman Empire in particular, but we might also think about the Greek successor states that are coming after the conquest of Alexander of Macedon, and other similar developments that are taking place. Perhaps we could think of the Persian Empire or other empires that are arising in antiquity. In this period of culture, we have an endpoint, which is the Enlightenment. And not just the Enlightenment, but also the Revolution and Freedom and the Terror. Where are we starting from? We're really starting from the Middle Ages and moving our way progressively through this. At least that's how Hegel is telling the story. So he tells us here that consciousness neither thinks of itself as this particular exclusive self, nor has substance the significance of an existence excluded from it, with which it would have to become united only by alienating itself from itself and at the same time producing the substance itself. So that sounds pretty good, but that sounds very different than what we traversed, particularly, like I said, in the last section of legal right or legal standing. So he goes on and he says, but the spirit whose self is an absolutely discrete unit. What is that? That is the spirit, that is the individual of legal right. And so we're talking about the self-consciousness of legal right in its relationship to a world which is going to be opposed to it. And the question is, what is its relationship with this world? And as it turns out, the relationship is going to be a lot more complicated than at first appears. So he tells us. It has its content confronting it as an equally hard, unyielding reality. Here, the world has the character of being something external, the negative of self-consciousness. So the object of self-consciousness in this case is the world against which it defines itself as an individual. And the world resists it. The world tells it no. The world, maybe even robs it of things. And it experiences the world in an antagonistic way, you could say. Now, he goes on and says this world is a spiritual entity. It is itself, nice phrase here, the interfusion of being and individuality. So the world is where something very important is taking place. And he tells us that its existence is actually the work of self-consciousness. So self-consciousness is laboring under a kind of illusion at this point in taking the world merely as a given, when really this world that exists is in part the work of self-consciousness. It is, you might say, the product of self-consciousness. And self-consciousness is doing something interesting to itself in this process. You notice I've got these three terms here laid out. And we'll come back to the text in a moment, but I really want to talk about these three terms, two of which we're going to see coming up over and over and over again in the text and coming up in important ways. First one is Entfremdung. We translate this as alienation or estrangement. Entfremdete is the spirit alienated from itself. Fremd, in this case, and then the ent, of course, that you see in each of these. Ent implies a kind of distancing, right? The fremdum means something that's alien to it, something that is other, something that is different. And so this is an othering of itself. It is losing its own grasp on its identity, you could say, or its certainty of itself. It feels alienated. When we talk about feeling alienated or being alienated, we mean that we have lost a part of ourself. Then there's also this other very important term, Entäußerung, right? Externalization. Again, very important within the Hegelian dialectic because we know that no idea really matters unless it can be externalized, can be made wirklich, actual, real, can be brought out into the world. And self-consciousness is doing precisely that, but it's also losing part of itself in externalizing itself in this way. And then Hegel in this passage is also going to talk about separation, Entweisung, right? So we've got these three ents here. And this is what self-consciousness is doing to itself. Now, it takes its experience as coming from the world doing that to it. But really, it is also involved in doing these things to itself. So he goes on and he says, the world is also an alien reality present and given. A reality has a being of its own and in which self-consciousness does not recognize it. So now he characterizes this world in several different ways. It is, on the one hand, he says, the world of legal right, the world that has been constituted in the stage of legal right. Everybody's got their piece. Everybody is a person in this. Nobody really matters more than anyone else, except, of course, for the Lord of the world. Somebody has to make all of this order work, right? And so he says the external world, which the Lord of the world of legal right takes to himself, is not merely this elemental being confronting the self as something contingently given. That seemed to be what the Lord of the world was. This guy happens to be in charge, and so that lucky bastard has all the authority and gets to enjoy the world, and we're stuck over here dealing with his arbitrariness and his caprices. That seems very contingent, right? Hegel here will talk about elemental being, something else he's going to hit on a little bit later in the next section. And he says that, here we go, it's not merely this elemental being confronting the self as something contingently given. On the contrary, it is his work. Whose work? Self-consciousness' work. But not in a positive, rather in a negative sense. Here's where we get the other ents coming in. It obtains its existence through self-consciousness' own externalization and separation of itself from its essence, which in the ruin and devastation which prevail in the world of legal right. Now, let's pause for a moment. Why is he talking about ruin and devastation in the world of legal right? Remember back to just a few paragraphs earlier where in the world of legal right, something like the movement that took place in the self-consciousness subsection of skepticism occurred. Skepticism turns not only against any positivity in the world, it also turns against itself, and it admits its own contingency and the very contingency of contingency. There is a kind of ruin, a kind of evacuation of meaningfulness that takes place. And that's happening here in this world and in self-consciousness' own separation from itself, its own externalization, its own alienation from itself. So he says that this appears to inflict on self-consciousness things from without. The violence of the liberated elements, the guys who are in charge, right? But he says these by themselves are sheer ruin and devastation and the dissolution of themselves. But this is just the self. It is their subject, their activity, and their process. So Hegel says we can actually get something out of this here. This activity and process is the process by which the substance becomes actual. But it takes place through the alienation of the personality. So he says the self that has an absolute significance in its immediate existence without having alienated itself from itself is without substance. At this point in time, alienation, which feels like a bad thing, actually turns out to be something good because it opens the door to development that is going to be taking place through this entire movement of culture. So now we have to see where all of this is going and how we're going to have these spiritual powers ordering themselves into a world, thereby preserving themselves, rather than just the arbitrariness of everybody's equal except for this guy who's most equal. Substance is, in this way, spirit, the self-conscious unity of the self and essence. Each has for the other the significance of alienation. Spirit is the consciousness of an objective real world freely existing on its own account. But this consciousness is confronted by the unity of the self and essence, actual consciousness by pure consciousness. On the one side, actual self-consciousness, through its externalization, passes over into the actual world, and the latter back into actual self-consciousness. On the other side, this same actuality, both person and objectivity, is superseded. They are purely universal. This, their alienation, is pure consciousness or essence. The present actual world has its antithesis directly in its beyond, which is both the thinking of it and its thought form, just as the beyond has in the present world its actuality, but an actuality alienated from it. Many readers of Hegel, quite understandably, when they're looking at this book, The Phenomenology, find the passages within it incredibly abstract, and they struggle to figure out, okay, what is exactly going on here? And I think that paragraph 485, it may not be the most abstract passage in the work as a whole, but it certainly gives many of them a run for their money. So the question that we want to ask here is, what is going on in this passage, in this paragraph 485? What is he talking about? And I think that although a lot of commentators really have liked this phrase that he begins with, substance becoming spirit, I wouldn't worry so much about that at this point in time. I would pay much closer attention to this discussion of the relation between actual consciousness and pure consciousness, not least because of where we are ultimately going to be going, not ultimately, but actually fairly shortly in the next few sections. So he does say substance in this way is spirit, the self-conscious unity of the self and essence. This is a formulation that's going to show up here a little bit later under pure consciousness as opposed to actual consciousness. He says each has for the other the significance of alienation. Now, what is the each? What is the having for the other? Is it substance and spirit that are having this? Is it supposed to be self and essence? We're going to have to see how this plays out. So he says, spirit is the consciousness of an objective real world freely existing on its own account. Now that's spirit at this point, right? It is also spirit earlier on. I mean, in the consciousness section, clearly we're being confronted with, at least with an object by the end of Force and the Understanding. We really are dealing with worlds. The world of self-consciousness is a world of others, and then we have the world of reason, once again turning at first to observation of nature, and then very quickly to observation of the human being, and then through looking at practical reason, human action. So anyway, he says, It's a consciousness of an objective real world freely existing on its own account, but this consciousness is confronted, again, he says, by the unity of self and essence. And now here he tells us that this confrontation is between actual consciousness, wirkliche Bewusstsein, and pure consciousness, reine Bewusstsein. So what is this pure consciousness? Are we sort of taking a transcendental turn at this point? No, not exactly. We're not doing metaphysics of a Kantian bent here. As a matter of fact, what we're going to be launching into, he's going to talk about a beyond. We're going to be talking about something that replicates some of the movements of the unhappy consciousness. If you remember, consciousness, self-consciousness in that case, was casting something that it alienated from itself out there as the divine, the absolute, the eternal, the unchanging, and it was dealing with its own actual consciousness, which was sort of not quite so good by comparison, something that it was not happy with. Here, we're going to be moving past the unhappy consciousness and ultimately into the realm of faith, which is not yet the same thing for Hegel as religion, which is a later section, but does have a similar beyond to it as well. So he goes on and he tells us actual self-consciousness, through its externalization, passes over into the actual world. Well, this is part of what we're going to see charted out in the paragraphs that are yet to come. These dynamics of how actual consciousness does externalize itself in the actual world. And then he says, and the latter back into actual self-consciousness. The world goes back into self-consciousness. There's a dynamic interplay between the two of them. But he says, on the other side, this same actuality is superseded. Right? When we're talking about the other side, we mean that of pure consciousness. The actual consciousness is sublated, it is superseded, it is aufgehoben. And this is, in fact, its alienation. He says, they are purely universal, person and objectivity. Their alienation is pure consciousness or essence. And, this is, if we want to make this a little bit more concrete, think about when you learn, now this is not what Hegel's saying here, but think about when you learn that the essence of you is to be a rational mortal animal, if we want to use, Boethius's formulation, right? Or a rational animal. We'll use Aristotle's formulation. That rational, forget the animal part, right? That's not so worrisome here. But that rational is a universal. What does it mean for you to be rational? Well, doesn't it end up meaning to be rational more or less in the same way as everybody else is rational? But then how is it you? How is it your own? It seems like the more that you behave rationally, the more that you conform to your essence, the less it's really you. So does that mean that you should behave irrationally? Well, then you would, in a certain sense, be taking yourself further away from the essence and further away from the purity of consciousness, and you'd be alienated in a different way as well. So it seems like alienation is almost inevitable at this point. So he goes on and he says, their alienation is pure consciousness or essence. The present actual world has its antithesis directly in a beyond, which is both the thinking of it and its thought form. Just as the beyond has in the present world its actuality, but, now notice what he says, an actuality alienated from it. Both sides need each other. The beyond requires, in order to be instantiated, actuality. But that actuality seems like its meaning is ebbing away from it. And the more that it comes to understand itself and its essence, the more it is superseded, the more it becomes alienated from itself.